decadence, I think to myself, maybe today is not going to be an interesting class, but I'm always disappointed because they're always interesting on them. Yes, and so yesterday what we were talking about was the responses of so let's see, what do we have to talk about? We were going to try to have a test on chapter 17, 18, 19 next Thursday, working on that. We're also working on the sectional differences. Joe, how are you making out on that? Did you meet with your group? And you have had a discussion?
Yes.
And you are making progress? Done. But anyways, okay. So, all right. So yesterday we're talking about abolition and the responses to abolition. And we talked about the southern response to abolition, which was what we expected. Hostility, digging in, etc. We talked about the northern response to abolition, which I don't know if it was unexpected, but I wonder if you kind of understood that most Northerners did not support abolition, and that many Northerners were hostile. And I think there is a mentality that in the North, people wanted to abolish slavery. In the South, they did not, and it was this kind of definite divide. It really wasn't like that at all. Most Northerners thought that slavery was wrong, right? I thought that slavery was wrong, thought that it was evil, thought that it was maybe sinful to some extent. But where they parted company with the abolitionists is that they didn't see practically how slavery could be immediately abolished without compensation or colonization. And so those things continue to be things that Northerners hold to. The idea of colonization is clearly not going to work. But Lincoln is talking about colonization right up through the Civil War, which is kind of interesting. So after we talked about that, we said, all right, well, if this is true, if most Americans, for one reason or another, did not think it was either practical or wise to abolish slavery, then how does slavery become an issue? And what we explained was that slavery becomes an issue not by its mere existence, but by its spread. Slavery becomes an issue because of expansion. In the 1840s, we said the country turns from a discussion of internal development to a discussion of expansion, right? Where there is a view that look, America is destined to spread its institutions and values and traditions from Atlantic to Pacific. And we call this notion manifest destiny. And ideas of manifest destiny festered in the 1840s and were perpetuated by politicians like John Tyler, who became the president. Remember, Harrison was elected to the presidency but only served for 4 weeks. He died, Tyler took over, and Tyler was a Whig in name only, and kind of promoted a more democratic ideology, causing Whigs that had helped to elect him as vice president to become frustrated with him. And so Tyler, is basically drummed out of the Whig Party. And in an effort to kind of find some issue that would rally people around him, Tyler looked towards expansion. And so we said, coming into the election of 44, and this is when we concluded yesterday, that the big issue in this election is going to be manifest destiny and expansion. And the two areas that become sources of discussion are Oregon, and let's pull down the map. Sometimes we pull down the map. How about when we do that, Mrs. Kolar, pull down the map, how much the kids like it?
Oh, I think they love it.
Yeah, they do love it when we pull down the map. Yes, this is not the same map as yesterday, but if Mrs. Kolar will get an up close of this, so if you watch this at your home, you'll be able to see that the big areas of discussion coming into the election of 44 is Oregon here, and this Oregon territory encompasses all of this green line, and Texas here. Right, Texas here, and Oregon. And so Americans are pushing westward here, and the notion of manifest destiny is that Texas and Oregon should be ours. Right? Texas and Oregon should be ours. Now, I think yesterday we were talking about Oregon. And what we said about Oregon is, look at, Jared, look at this vast area here. In 1841, there were only 500 Americans in that vast area. And the area had been at one time or another claimed by the Spanish, it had been claimed by the Russians, it had been claimed by the British, it had been claimed by the Americans. But what we determined to do in 1818 is to jointly occupy it. Remember, in 1818, Britain and the United States decided to divide the Louisiana Purchase at the 49th parallel, right here. Now, the United States would have been content to continue this line right to the Pacific, but Britain didn't want to do it. And since there were so few Britons and Americans in this territory, Britain and the United States decided that they would just jointly occupy it. You know, Americans and Britons would go there, it would be jointly occupied, and that would be it, and it would be discussed at a future day. By 1844, however, Americans were streaming into the Oregon Territory in the Willamette Valley across the Oregon Trail. Remember, Bobby, we talked about the Oregon Trail, and that caused you to think back on your elementary days when you did that program. Remember that, Sam, when you were fondly just looking out into the distance, thinking about your elementary days when you did the Oregon Trail? On the Oregon Trail, they came 5,000 settlers there, and when they did, the expansionists said, look, we have seized Oregon for America, and all of this territory should be America's. And the adage that comes into the 44 election is 54-40 or fight. This was the 54-40 line. So what they were saying is, look, we'll take all of Oregon from the British or we'll fight them. That slogan is kind of a manifestation of manifest destiny. 54-40 or fight. So coming into the election of 44, expansion is an issue. The question is, where are we going to expand to? Answer, Oregon. Second answer, Texas. All right, now Texas, we say, okay, Texas. Let's talk about Texas for a minute. Texas was a part of Mexico, a recognized part of Mexico. Texas was a part of Mexico, and if you can see this right here, this area here was established as the border between Mexican Texas and America in 1819. Does anybody know what the treaty was? We talked about it. It's just super fun. I mean, I wouldn't expect you to know. Chris, you know the name of the treaty that established the border between Texas and America? Anybody besides the instructor know the answer to that? Joe, you're a super genius. You remember like all those hockey dates when you know? Yeah, go ahead. Adams on Street. The treaty that got us Florida, Adams on is right here. At the Adams on Street, the treaty that got us Florida also established this border. Right? Now, Texas was a province of Mexico, and Mexico was a part of Spain. And so, Mexico was a Spanish colony, a Spanish possession. Mexico was a part of Spain. Texas was a province in Mexico, right? We had a recognized border between the United States and Texas, right? You know, that was established by treaty, right, with the Spanish in 1819. Now, in 1820, a guy named Moses Austin had conversations with the Mexican/Spanish government about moving settlers out of the United States and into Texas. Moses Austin. Get it? Austin, Texas. He's following this? Moses Austin, 1820. He got permission from the then Mexican Spanish government to move 300 families, Americans, out of America into Mexico. Moses Austin is never going to do that, right? He is never going to do that. He's never going to live to do that. His son, however, Stephen Austin, is going to actually implement that. In 1823, Moses Austin's son, Stephen Austin, is going to lead 300 American families into Texas. Here. Now, here's the thing about this. In 23, when Stephen Austin leads those American families there, Mexico is no longer a part of Spain. It had gotten its independence. So now it was an independent country. An independent country that allowed Stephen Austin to follow up on what his father had arranged with the Spanish government and move Americans into Texas. Now, by 1830, maybe 20 to 30,000 Americans were living in Texas. Right? Now, here's the thing. Texas was a part of Mexico. Mexico was a foreign country. Right? I mean, they were not in the United States. They had left the United States and migrated to Texas. And they kept coming. 20 to 30,000 and rising. Now here's the question. Why would Americans want to leave the United States of America and move to Mexico? And why would the Mexicans want them? It seems, in light of what's happening today, it seems kind of ironic. Right? You know, that here go the Americans, they're going to Mexico, right? Because Texas is part of Mexico. So they keep going there, to the point where in 1830 the Mexicans said, whoa, 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 there's too many Americans coming over here. So the first question is, why would the Americans want to go there in the first place? And then the second question is, why would the Mexicans want them? So you can pick any question to respond to. Who will, Matt, who in this room do you think will respond to either of those questions? I mean, who would be likely to respond? You can pick either question. Why did they go there, or why did they want them? Who do you think might be a good person to respond to?
Sam.
Sam right here. Oh, that's an excellent choice. Sam, why? Pick either one. Why would Americans, they kept coming, they're crossing the border, they're going into a foreign country. How come?
Maybe they were looking for some new land.
Well, I think it's possible. Look now, before Sabu responds, go ahead, Sabu, go ahead and answer.
Maybe because someone in South were as powerful or influent as like the plantation owners, and they want to see more, prosperity economically and socially.
Yeah, what Sabu is said is that, you know, maybe they were seeking economic opportunity. One thing that you can always say, anytime even there's a movement of people, even a movement of one person, it's always one or two reasons or a combination of both, push and a pull. Think about it. Anytime, even if an individual moves, either something's pushing them out of where they're at, or something's pulling them into where they're going. So we say, okay, what's the push and the pull? What pulled people out of America? Right? Well, what may have pulled people out of America is that Texas had very good cotton growing land that was simply less expensive. Right? Texas had cotton growing land that was less expensive. And Sabu is right. I can now go into Texas and be a plantation owner and grow cotton and live in a big house and have slaves and be a plantation owner like the people in Louisiana and Mississippi and Georgia. I can just keep going, right? And I can do that on the cheap because Texas, the land is cheaper. So it had very good cotton land that was less expensive. The push may have been, it's the Panic of 1819, you know, bad economic times possibly, right? That was the case maybe on some level. I mean, there's always some discussion about people fleeing from the wall, going into Texas. That may have been a push. But it's probably more a pull than a push that pulled people into Texas. Now, an interesting question is, why would the Mexicans want them? You know, I mean, after all, this is Mexico. Why would we want Americans to come in? What did the Mexicans hope to gain? Go ahead, Jacob.
Maybe if more Americans lived there, they didn't try to sell it. Drop the price before they actually sell it.
Well, yeah, I think that they were trying to increase the value of the territory there. They wanted the population. They wanted Mexicans to go there. They wanted Americans to go there. They wanted, just like, why did we let the Irish come? Why would we stop them? Right? The Irish were coming. We don't. Why do we let the Germans come? We could have stopped them. You know, we don't. Right? So why would the Mexicans not want the Americans to come to areas that were relatively uninhabited, inhabit them and develop them for Mexico? They did. Here was the problem. The Mexicans expected the Americans to come there to become Mexicans. They were required to convert to Catholicism. They were required to learn Spanish. much like you kids like to speak Spanish, right? With Mr. Doonan. Now, Matt, you enjoy speaking Spanish, you do not down there. So they had to learn Spanish. They had to become Catholics. They had to become Mexican citizens. They had, basically, what the Mexicans demanded of them was that they assimilate into Mexican culture. This doesn't happen. This does not happen. The Americans ignore all of the things that Mexico required of them. I mean, Mexico required them to learn Spanish. They did not. Mexico required them to convert to Catholicism. They did not. Mexico eventually abolishes slavery and demands, they prohibit the Americans from bringing their slaves there, and then once they do, they say, you got to release these people. The Americans don't. The Americans basically wanted to be Americans in Mexico, and then eventually wanted America to take over Texas. Right? Now, by the late 1830s, the Mexicans kind of discover this. They said, holy cow, I mean, this isn't working out the way we want it to work out. The Americans are coming in here, they're not assimilating, they are starting to kind of talk about independence. We are fearful that our province of Texas is going to be overrun. So they try to limit immigration in 1830. And in 1835, a Mexican dictator by the name of Santa Anna takes over, and Santa Anna tries to kind of destroy all sort of local rule in Texas. Now, I should tell you that in Texas there were also Mexicans there. There were Americans and Mexicans, and there, Texas was growing, and people were at some level prospering. And when Santa Anna tried to get it under control, the Texans basically revolted. Now, they said that Santa Anna was violating their rights. Now, you might say, what rights? I mean, you're in Mexico. You don't have any rights under the Constitution. They argued that Santa Anna was violating their rights under the Mexican Constitution. And therefore, they were going to declare themselves independent. That's exactly what they did. They declare themselves independent in 1836. So the Texans declare themselves independent from Mexico. Now, as this is transpiring, here is the Texans in Texas, which is a part of Mexico, who have revolted from the Mexican government. What's the United States position in all this? This is fundamentally none of our business, right? I mean, this is an internal dispute within Mexico. It's not, I mean, the United States government doesn't have any standing in this, and we kind of didn't. But the overwhelming majority of people in Texas were Americans, and most Americans were sympathetic with the Texans. And many Americans expected that if this revolt was successful, that Texas would be annexed into the Union. Now, I mean, Santa Anna sends an army to put down the Texas Revolution, and overwhelms a holdout of part of the Texas Army at the Alamo Mission in San Antonio. Barrett Travis, I mean, the Alamo, there were 187 Americans and Texans that were at the Alamo, and Santa Anna surrounded them with 5,000 men. The Alamo Mission, I could read you an account of it. It's kind of interesting. Now, this is not a part of American history, really. I mean, yeah, they were mostly Americans, but this is all happening basically in Mexico, right? And we know what happened. Santa Anna told the Texans, if you don't surrender, right, there's 187, if you don't surrender, when we take over the mission here, we're going to kill all of you. So that was an incentive to get them to surrender. So if you don't surrender, we'll accept your surrender right now. But if you don't surrender, once we do take over, we're going to kill you all. Well, Barrett Travis, this is where this comes from, allegedly drew a line in the sand, right? A line in the sand. Who wants to surrender? Nobody. And so eventually Santa Anna's forces broke through. Now, before you think it's just kind of, heroic suicide, they expected to be bailed out. They expected that an army from the rest of Texas would come and bail them out, but that doesn't get there. So Santa Anna's forces breach the walls of the Alamo, and they fight to the last man. Now there's all kind of discussion about this. They allegedly, Davy Crockett died swinging Davy Crockett was there, he died swinging his rifle at the Mexicans. That he ran out of bullets, and the only, all he had left was his rifle. And so he was riddled full of bullets, and then he died there in plane. Now, that's one version. Another version, he was saying, please don't shoot. So what happened, we don't entirely know, because the only people that were left were some of the women that were there, and the Mexicans, because they killed all the Texans. And then after they killed them, they put their bodies into a big heap, poured oil on them, and burned them. Those no good Mexicans. I mean, not only did they do that, now they promised they would do that, and from there, they moved towards kind of destroying the Texas Revolution. Here's an account of it, which I think is pretty good. Led by Santa Anna, an overwhelming Mexican force swarmed into Texas. At the Alamo in San Antonio, approximately 200 Texans held off some 5,000 Mexicans for 12 days. Then on March 6, 1836, the Americans perished to a man, including Davy Crockett, surrounded by heaps of his dead foes. 3 weeks later, a Texas force under James Fannin, numbering about 400 recent volunteers from the United States, surrendered at Goliad. Over 300 men were massacred in cold blood. With victorious Mexicans crying, "Exterminate to the sublime," the Lone Star was in danger of flicking out. Scores of panic-stricken Texans' families were stampeding towards the American border. Seemingly all Santa Anna had to do was reach out and crush Sam Houston's disorganized force, and the rebellion would be over. But at San Juanito, on April 21st, 1836, the tiny Texas army turned furiously upon the overconfident pursuers, many of whom were enjoying their afternoon siestas. With cries of "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad! Death to Santa Anna!" the Mexican force was routed. The cowering Santa Anna, disguised in the uniform of a common soldier, was found hiding in the tall grass near the battlefield. Sam Houston, realized he was worth more to Texas alive than dead, so with difficulty he persuaded his followers not to take vengeance into their own hands. On May 14, 1836, the quaking dictator, obviously under duress, agreed to sign 2 treaties. By their terms, the fighting was to cease, Mexican troops were to leave Texas, and preparations were made for a peace convention. And Texas was not to extend beyond the Rio Grande. Now, basically, what happens here? Well, after the Alamo, the Mexicans go forward and they destroy a tiny army of Texans at Goliad. Same thing, put everybody to the sword, burn their bodies. And then Sam Houston, who was the commander of the Texan forces, is kind of like being chased by Santa Anna. And then, apparently, according to this source, Santa Anna's army took a nap, and Sam Houston turned his army around and attacked them. And not only did he defeat them, but they captured Santa Anna. And so after capturing Santa Anna, who was the head of the military and the leader of the country, they made him sign a document saying that Texas was independent. So now the Mexicans are declaring Texas independent. Now you could argue, the Mexicans are going to later argue, hey, this was under duress, this doesn't count, we don't recognize this. But Texas was now an independent country. This is in 1836. Now, you would think this. You would think, okay, Texas is independent, right? It's predominantly Americans, right? Quickly, America will annex Texas as a state. That doesn't happen. In fact, incidentally, when this is happening, who's the president in 1836? Jackson. Well, and he knew Sam Houston. They were buddies. So you would think that Jackson would immediately recognize Texas and tell the Mexicans, if you don't like it, too bad. He does not. Jackson does not recognize Texas as an independent country until the last day he is in office. Who's Jackson's successor? Van Buren. Van Buren shows a noticeable lack of interest in annexing Texas. So Texas is an independent country, right? An independent country in 1836, 1837, 1838, 1841. It's an independent country. Now, I mean, as Texas continues to be an independent country, it becomes increasingly troubling to some people. Well, let me ask you this. Texas wanted to be annexed into the Union. why does Jackson wait so long? Why does Van Buren ignore Texas virtually completely and not move to annex it? Isn't that an interesting question? Yes, go ahead.
It offset the balance of slavery.
Oh, so in English, what you are saying to me is the issue in the annexation of Texas was slavery. Texas was vast. I mean, it was a vast territory. How many states could be carved out of this? If Texas was annexed into the Union, would it be one state? Would it be 5 to 7 states? And if it was 5 to 7 states, would all of those states be slave states? What was this all about? I mean, some people in the North said, whoa, wait a minute, we get the picture. So Southern slaveholders went into Texas to acquire this so that they can spread slavery. So what this is about is not necessarily spreading American institutions and values. This is about the spread of slavery. That issue is so... Oh, the kids leaving. Mrs. Fuller, the kids leave right in the middle of the class, right? They go off to take the Keystone examination.
Like an example.
Yeah. Which one are you? Department of Defense.
All right, can I see
Yeah, you kids are lucky. They're very unlucky, those kids. You kids are lucky. All right, so what do we got, Bob? We got why that Texas wasn't... We got why Texas was not annexed. And we said, really, the reason that Texas is not annexed is because of this issue of slavery. That Van Buren doesn't want to touch it. Jackson is even reluctant to touch it. Texas is kind of hanging out there. Mexico disavows their recognition of Texas and basically says, hey, look, Texas is still part of the, Mexico, right? We don't accept Texas as being an independent country. The Americans refused to annex them, and so Texas just starts being an independent country. Look, by 1844, Texas was recognized by the British, by the French, right? So they were a recognized independent country. However, by 1844, an independent Texas was increasingly seeming problematic to Southerners because the British were showing a deep interest in building relations with an independent Texas and then promoting the abolition of slavery there. And so Southerners like John Tyler and John C. Calhoun and others that were fearful for slavery thought, look, we've got to get Texas annexed into the Union. So coming into the election of 1844, the annexation of Texas, who had for 8 years been an independent country, and the acquisition of all of Florida, or not Florida, Oregon, became the two big territorial issues. Now, the Democratic Party had historically been the party of expansion. You know, I mean, since the time of Jefferson and the Louisiana Purchase, and Jackson had been a supporter of expansion. And so naturally, the Democratic Party, in large part, supported kind of expanding America's influence. The Whig Party had historically been the party of internal development. They had been the party of the American system. They had been the party of internal improvements and tariffs. So the Whig Party was far more content to focusing on building the country as it existed than expanding it any further. The Democratic Party tended to be more likely to support expansion. Now, this is with exceptions. You know, there were Whigs that were expansionists and Democrats that weren't, but that's generally the way it was. So now the Democrats were in a quandary. Because in 1844, the leading candidate for the nomination for the Democratic Party was, again, Van Buren. Van Buren fully expected to be nominated for the presidency. He had been Jackson's confidant, Jackson's vice president. He had served as president. He had been defeated by William Henry Harrison in 40. But now by 44, Van Buren was so confident that the Democrats were going to nominate him. And he was also so confident that the Whigs were going to nominate Henry Clay, that they actually met. Clay and Van Buren met in advance of them being nominated and decided that they were going to take annexation of Texas off the table as an issue. That's what we're going to talk about. The problem was for Van Buren is that John C. Calhoun, his ancient rival, remember Peggy Eaton? John C. Calhoun had rejoined the Democratic Party and was going to do his darndest to keep Van Buren from getting the nomination. The other problem that Van Buren had is that he was an opponent of expansion. And many of the Democrats saw this as an opportunity to expand America's influence into Texas. Slaveholders in the South that were Democrats thought it was a great idea. Into Oregon, Northern Democrats thought that, this would be a great idea to provide economic opportunity. And Van Buren was out of step with that. But the question was, if not Van Buren, who then? And the answer was James K. Polk. James K. Polk. James K. Polk is the first, what we call, dark horse in American history. Going into the convention, the Democratic Convention in 1844, not too many people were talking about Polk as a presidential candidate. But coming out of the convention, Polk is the nominee. And this has a lot to do with Jackson. Can you believe it? Jackson is still alive, right? He's not only still alive, he's frustrated with his old buddy Van Buren, because Van Buren did not support the annexation of Texas. And Jackson was a supporter of Polk's. Polk was Jackson's neighbor. I mean, Polk was from Tennessee. Polk had been the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He had been the two-time governor of Tennessee. He had been a confidant of Jackson's. In fact, people called him Young Hickory. I think Polk was only 44 years old. He was relatively young. He was not well known. He certainly wasn't as well known as Henry Clay. But Polk was an unabashed expansionist. He was a defender of slavery, an unabashed expansionist, a Jacksonian Democrat. His nickname was Young Hickory. Get it? Old Hickory, Young Hickory. So Polk is the candidate of the Democratic Party. The Whigs do, in fact, nominate Henry Clay. This is the third time for Clay. Clay had been a presidential candidate in 24, had been defeated. He had been a presidential candidate in 32, had been defeated. Now he was a presidential candidate in 44. Now, Polk the Kentuckian was, according to your textbook, the best known man in the country. Right? He was well known. His views were well known. He had served in various capacities in government, and he believed that his time had come to be the president. The Whigs kind of dismissed Polk. They said, who is James K. Polk? Who is this guy? I mean, compared to Henry Clay, who is this guy? The 44 election is the first election in American history that turns on foreign policy. And the issue is expansion. Polk is an unabashed expansionist. If elected, I will push for the annexation of Texas. If elected, I'll push for the annexation of Texas. If elected, 54-40 or fight. All of Oregon or none of it. So Polk is not vacillating. He's an unabashed expansionist. Clay vacillates. Clay says, well, Bobby, is this another important text message that you have there today? Very important text message. We don't do that in the advanced placement. But Clay, right, at first said, oh, I don't support the annexation of Texas. He's kind of appealing to the Whigs that were anti-slavery. And so Clay, but then later it becomes apparent that Southerners support that. So he says, well, I personally support the annexation of Texas, but I don't know about the government. And so the result is that Clay vacillates. And we're not sure if that helped him or hurt him, but we do know this, that when the votes are tallied, Clay loses by a very narrow margin. And in fact, Clay's victory, or Clay's defeat, can be credited to a small third party called the Liberty Party. The Liberty Party was a little tiny third party that had run
All students who are scheduled to take the Section 2 of the Keystone Test are to report to the designated testing areas at this time.
The Liberty Party had run a candidate in 40, and what they were about is liberty. They were an anti-slavery party. They drew enough votes from Clay in New York to give New York to Polk, and Polk wins the election. Now, Polk wins the election in 44, and after he's elected, he sets 4 goals. He sets 4 goals. And judging him by what he wanted to do and what he did, Polk might be one of the most effective presidents in American history. So Polk said, look, I want to do 4 things. All right? 4 things. And I want to do them in 4 years. And I'm only going to serve 1 term, and I'm going to accomplish all 4 of these things in 1 term, and that's going to be it. That's exactly what he does. Polk is going to work himself to death. He's a committed worker. You know, he works tirelessly. He's reluctant to delegate authority. He is driven. Your textbook says that one person said of Polk, what he goes for, he fetches. In other words, when he said he would accomplish these 4 things, he was going to accomplish these 4 things. Here's what they were. First, Polk was committed to tariff reduction. Right? He was going to reduce tariffs first. Second, he was committed to reestablishing an independent treasury. So first, tariff reductions. Second, an independent treasury. Third, he was committed to resolving the Oregon question. Resolving. Note what I said, Bobby. Resolving. Polk doesn't say 54-40 or fight when he establishes his objectives. He says, I'm committed to resolving the Oregon question. And fourthly, he's committed to acquiring California. Now somebody has to ask a question at this point. Bobby, you must ask a question, yes.
Why isn't he about Texas?
What happened to Texas? Wasn't this whole election about Texas? Well, the reason that one of Polk's goals is not the annexation of Texas, by the time he was inaugurated, it was annexed already. Tyler tried to make the annexation of Texas his legacy. So as a lame duck president, Tyler tirelessly pushed Congress for annexation, which was accomplished by joint resolution prior to Polk being inaugurated. So by the time that Polk was inaugurated, Texas was already annexed. Now, when Texas was annexed by the United States prior to Polk taking office, the Mexicans withdrew their ambassador from the United States. They broke off diplomatic relations. Because the Mexicans are going to argue this. The Mexicans are going to argue that you just basically annexed part of our country. That we don't recognize Texas as an independent country, even though Texas has been independent for 9 years. Right? Texas has been independent for 9 years. We don't recognize it as an independent country. It's part of Mexico. You just annexed part of our country, so we're going to call home our ambassador, and maybe someday we'll fight you. Right? You know, I mean, think about it. What if Canada would take like Maine, you know, and annex Maine into the Union? We're not going to recognize that, and you know, we would probably fight over that. Well, that's the same thing. Now, it's a little bit different here in this situation because Texas has been an independent country for 9 years, and the Mexicans had made 2 kind of half-hearted attempts to reestablish power there. So it was pretty clear that not only the United States recognized Texas, but so did England and France. But nevertheless, the Mexicans withdrew their ambassador. Now, okay, that's going to complicate things because if you think about Polk's 4th goal, Polk's 4th goal is to annex, not annex, but to acquire California. Well, California's a part of Mexico. Well, the Mexicans are mad at us, right? They withdrew their ambassador. How are we going to convince them to sell us the territory when we just took the territory in their view from us? But remember, Polk's a determined guy. So Matt, just quickly. First goal, tariff reduction, accomplished. 42, something called the Walker Tariff. The Walker Tariff. Reduce tariffs even further. So Polk wanted lower tariffs, he got lower tariffs. Pushed Congress to accomplish that. Second goal, independent treasury, Polk got it. Right? He divorced, no third bank in the United States, divorced the Treasury from banking, right? Established an independent Treasury that was not connected to the banking system. This probably was not necessarily beneficial for the country, but he did in fact accomplish it. Third goal, resolution of Oregon. After all of the rhetoric of 54-40 or fight, Polk offers to divide it at the 49th. So after all of that rigmarole of 54-40 or fight, Polk is willing to compromise, willing to divide with the British the territory at the 49th. It is the British who refused to accept that in 1818, and initially they even rejected Polk, which really irritated them. But eventually the British government, and further reflection, decides, well, gee, there's just not enough Brits up there to fight over this. And look, this is a vast area, we'll take the deal. So in 1846, Oregon is divided at the 49th, and the 49th becomes the northern border of Canada. And what this leaves us with, Catherine, is California. And obviously, California is what leads us to war with Mexico. We'll talk about that tomorrow.